Hi, I'm Byron Williams. I'm Director of the Public Interest Law Center, or PILC. PILC is an office of dedicated legal professionals, and we work with the law to advance economic and social equality. Our clients are individuals or groups who want to make changes in the areas of environmental law, human rights, consumer rights, access to justice, and the revitalization and assertion of Indigenous legal orders. Our team has helped put together this webinar series because public engagement with legal processes is a cornerstone of democracy. The ongoing climate change crisis and our shared responsibility towards reconciliation makes this engagement particularly relevant in the area of environmental law. We've invited guest speakers to share their knowledge and to improve public understanding how each of us can do our little bit more to engage in the decision-making process that impacts us all. We're so grateful that you've joined this discussion, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you.
My name's Glenn Korolick. I'm the Executive Director of the Manitoba Eco Network, and we're one of the sponsors of the Navigating the Law series, along with the Public Interest Law Center. For those who don't know anything about the Manitoba Eco Network, we're a nonprofit, charitable environmental organization. We've been around for about 35 years. The organization is doing some great stuff these days with all the volunteers and our new board of directors, and a good example is this webinar series, which we hope you'll enjoy. If you have any feedback after the session, please provide it to us, and we're always looking to make improvements. Once again, thank you for attending, and I hope you have an enjoyable webinar, and we'll talk to you again.
Good afternoon. Again, Byron Williams. I'm the Director of the Public Interest Law Center, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the kickoff to the Navigating the Law to Protect the Environment webinar series. Today's topic is environmental racism and the law. And in that spirit, I wish to acknowledge that we are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, and we acknowledge the harm and mistakes of the past. And we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And we're going to get to our fabulous guest speakers in just a moment, but there are a couple of organizations and individuals I do wish to acknowledge. This webinar is only made possible with the support of the Manitoba Law Foundation. And we've been in a great collaboration with the University of Winnipeg. Dr. Patricia Fitzpatrick has been guiding the spirit of these webinars. And we certainly thank Oliver, the cat, and his human owner, Evan, who are providing technical assistance for this meeting. Just in terms of where we're going to be going in the webinar, I'll speak briefly just in terms of introducing our guest speakers. And then Chief Cook is going to provide her opening discussion, followed by Dr. McIvor. And then we'll have certainly about 10 minutes where Bruce and Chief Cook can chat back and forth. And then we will be allowing or hoping for about 13 minutes of questions starting at around 12:40. There's a chat function on Zoom. Even I can operate it. And if you have questions that you wish to pose to Chief Cook or to Dr. McIvor or to the both of them, please put them in the chat function. And then Ms. Heather Fast, who's a professor at the Robson Hall Faculty of Law will be sharing some of those questions with the speakers. It is my great pleasure to introduce both of our speakers. Chief Heidi Cooks is from Grand Rapids, Manitoba. She is a member of the Mispaistick Cree Nation. I apologize for that, Chief Cook. I've been practicing my pronunciation all day. She holds a BA in Environmental Sustainability and Politics and a Master's in Development Practice in Indigenous Development. And that's from our very own University of Winnipeg. Heidi served for 6 years as a band counselor for her community. And in July of this year, she was elected chief of Mispaistick. Prior to her time as an elected official, Heidi also worked in the Traditional Lands and Water Office. Dr. Bruce McIvor is a principal of First Peoples Law Corporation. His work involves both litigation and negotiation on behalf of Indigenous people across Canada. He's an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia, the Allard School of Law, and a published author, and he tells me he's quite bright. Bruce holds a law degree, a PhD in Aboriginal and Environmental History, and is a Fulbright Scholar. He's a proud Métis from the Red River in Manitoba. And Chief Cook, we're hoping that you can lead off our discussion. And obviously, we're hoping to, and we expect to talk about environmental racism. And please lead away. Thank you.
Thank you, Byron, and to all the organizers. It's a pleasure today. You mentioned I grew up in Grand Rapids, so environmental racism is something that I've known since before I knew what it was. I grew up with an awareness of hydro and government as not to be trusted, and a real visceral anger towards these entities that I didn't fully understand. I grew up at Lovers Point, part of town called Lovers Point, which is less than 1 kilometer from the generating station. So at night, I can hear the hum of the generators instead of the roar of the rapids that this place is identified by. When I was young, we used to go for picnics along the riverbed, and I never knew that was where the rapids were until I was older. I think I was in my 20s when I was doing my bachelor's actually at the UW. I did a research project and I found some pictures of the rapids, and they broke my heart, and it really helped me to start understanding all the feelings that I grew up with, and the anger that I felt. It wasn't just something that affected my family and my community, it was something that affected me too, and it was my birthright that I lost. So the loss is personalized for me, and you know, that was the start of my understanding, I guess. I'll say that I think hydro dams exist in First Nation territories because of environmental racism and how it is allowed in the law, and the impacts are not just limited to the construction of dams, but they continue as long as these dams are operating. So for myself, I'm intergenerationally affected. Obviously, I didn't see that initial destruction taking place and don't have those experiences personally, but I do have vicarious trauma because it happened in my community and to my family. And I also have my own impacts that I experienced living in Grand Rapids. And I've learned that at the time when the hydro dam was built here, it was the first one in the north, that the consequences on the people, on the land, the water, the wildlife, those were well known, as well as the economic consequences for, largely land-based economies. In the time since then, we have a couple of agreements, settlement agreements with hydro to try and address some of those historic and ongoing impacts. But I'd say that those are not really adequate to address or lift our people out of the poverty that's been manufactured. Right now, the majority of our employment opportunities are cleaning up hydro's mess. Like, we have driftwood and debris crews that work every year, and every time the spillway is opened, there's more debris that gets washed into Lake Winnipeg. So I think, I'm happy to be part of the discussion today. I think it's very relevant given, the growing awareness of the systemic failures of governments and the law and coming to light for more people. It gives me hope that more people are not content to passively participate in oppression and discrimination, and to sit back and benefit from those things, but there's more motivation to make changes, and I think that's part of what this webinar series is trying to facilitate as well. I think that the calls for justice from people who are actually benefiting from the disparities in the law can be very powerful in the movement towards justice and reconciliation. I know it's possible to change our human laws to reflect the current understanding on what justice is. And I wanted to also talk about, different understanding of law that we have. The natural laws, the original instructions that each being on this earth is given, and that these laws are not alterable. And that when we observe and maintain the relationships between all beings in accordance with the natural laws, we do that in accord, we follow these principles that some people maybe have heard of, like love, respect, sharing, and honesty. Those are part of our original instructions, and those are laws that we must follow, otherwise there are consequences. And I think when those natural laws are broken, those consequences are being seen today. Byron mentioned climate change in his introduction, and I think that is an example of a consequence of breaking those natural laws and how we relate to the earth and to all other living beings. 2020, there's a lot of examples of how climate change can fail with the pandemic. It's emerging from abuse of animals and encroaching on their homes, their territories, and the consequences massive that we're all living through right now. Also, I guess here in Mississippi, we've started to address some of our rebuilding and our governance by trying to build our governance systems on those foundations of the national law and the principles. One example we have is our Canadian our Indigenous Guardians program. And the Canadian are the ones who will take care of something for the future generations. So they monitor and they care for our land, our water, and they educate people on how to do that as well. And we've seen, immediate benefits in terms of health in our territory, health of our people, health of our lands, health of our waters, and it's making a real positive difference. I know across the country, Indigenous guardians are starting to engage in this work more and more, and that there's real benefits that can be seen in terms of health, justice, and sustainability. And if I start going on guardians, I'll take up the entire hour, so I'll just stop there and I'll hand it over to Bruce for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Cook, and Bruce, over to you, sir.
Thanks, thanks, Chief. And I just wanted to pick up on one of the comments that you made, the one about passive participation in this environmental racism. And I was looking at the number of participants. We're up to 79, and how, all of us doing these things, the 79 participating, and thanks for participating, are passively participating in environmental racism right at this moment. And this is one of the great problems, particularly with hydroelectricity, because most people are unaware of it. Like you're talking about, Chief, they don't hear the hum of the generators. They get to turn on their computer with the electricity. They get to turn on the lights, turn on the furnace. And the power of that comes through not just in Manitoba, but largely across the country, comes based on a fundamental racism against Indigenous people. Because as the Chief was talking about, it's Indigenous people most often who feel the effects. They're the ones who feel the effects. They're the ones, like you were saying, Chief, that the loss of the rapids. And it's part of your life. It's kind of built right into who you are, and you're not even aware of it, like you say at times. This is how you're growing up, right? That's how insidious it can be. And so many non-Indigenous people in Manitoba, across the country, are benefiting from it in a passive way, and they're not even aware of it. And that, I think, is one of the real serious challenges. We have to find a way to make people aware. I think about water, because I know a lot of the people here, you might have a glass of water in front of you, particularly if you're in Winnipeg, you take a sip. Now you probably might know where that water comes from. That if you're in Winnipeg, it comes from Shoal Lake. One of my clients, Shoal Lake 40, and they did such an effective job of making Winnipeggers and Manitobans aware that they were the ones who are at the other end of the pipe, and they're on the second longest boiled water advisory in Canada. And so many Winnipeggers were shocked. They had no idea. What? I just thought I turned on the tap and I have this wonderful water to drink. And I remember with Shoal Lake 40, one of the things they did, we had so many meetings in Winnipeg, when someone reached at a meeting to take a sip, they would say, hey, do you know where that water comes from, right? You know where that comes from, and that we're on a boiled water advisory. We can't drink our water ourselves. And similarly to what the Chief was saying, they could hear the hum of the traffic on the Trans-Canada Highway and didn't have a road themselves. They could hear it at night. And the thing with that was they were able to make that connection. I think that's really powerful. It's to make people aware. And I was thinking about this webinar. How do you start doing that with hydroelectricity, right? It's maybe some of the meetings we should have in the dark. Turn off the lights. Maybe you'll appreciate it a little bit more if the lights are turned off. You'll, oh yeah, right. Where does this come from? You know, that disconnect and that sense that Indigenous people don't even exist. You get the benefits from so-called development. Just that whole word makes me cringe. Development. What do you mean develop? What are you developing? Like this was some kind of wilderness, undeveloped land that's just waiting there to be developed through a hydro dam. Just it's embedded in the language itself. So I think if we're starting to engage with serious issues about environmental racism, that disconnect is one of the ones, like the chief was saying, that we do need to start with. Connect people to the real impacts on Indigenous people and on the environment. And then the second point that I wanted to pick up on was the one the chief was making about the guardians. I know we've talked about this before. That is fundamental because it really represents Indigenous people going back out there and exercising their decision making, their stewardship, guardianship over their lands and waters. And that's another one of the things that, like the connection to where the hydro has come from kind of disappears, is that right and responsibility that Indigenous people have. So many non-Indigenous people are totally unaware of that. When you raise it, I know I do across the country, when you raise it with government people about, yeah, they're exercising their own decision-making here. And you'll get a blank face. What are you talking about? Isn't it the government that makes decisions? I.e. the provincial and federal government? That's where all the decision-making authority rests. And that they've totally been led to blank out the fact that Indigenous people themselves have decision-making authority. And that's fundamental to the treaty relationship. Understanding treaties, to a large extent, is understanding that Indigenous people never gave up their decision-making authority. That's part of the treaty. They have a responsibility and they have a right to exercise that decision-making authority over their lands. And that if that can be recognized, just like the impacts themselves can be recognized, then I think we're really on the road somewhere productive and promising. When you start to recognize those principles, oh, we ought to think about how we're doing these things. It's not just about development. It's not just about turning on the tap or turning on the hydro. And it's not just about provincial governments or Manitoba Hydro making decisions. It's about Indigenous people making decisions themselves to protect their own water and lands and future generations so that they can grow up not like what the chief was talking about. You didn't even realize, oh my God, we're in the midst of this. It's like inside the whale. You don't realize it exists, but they can say, you know what, we're taking back control of this. If we can move in that direction, then I think we're really on a promising path. But it's important that non-Indigenous people recognize the role they have to play. They have a role to play there. It's not just Indigenous people that should be at the forefront all the time. They need the support of non-Indigenous people to be telling everyone, including Manitoba Hydro, including governmental officials, we think the principles that you're operating on recognize Indigenous decision-making authority and responsibility for the land and water. So thanks very much for the time to make a few comments, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
So we will just encourage people to park their questions in the chat room. But before we turn to them, I know I have some questions of my own, but Chief Cook and Bruce, I'm going to encourage the two of you to speak a little bit more directly to each other. And Chief Cook, if there's anything that you'd like to respond to in what Bruce has talked about, addressing the disconnect, exercising your rights and responsibilities, the essential need to recognize treaty and decision makings, and the role that non-Indigenous people can play in supporting, or otherwise, please feel welcome. And I'll encourage the two of you to speak back and forth with each other.
Who's gonna go first?
I think it's you, Chief.
Right?
You're the chief's always the boss.
I guess, you know, there's so much that you packed in there. I don't know where to start, but I think, you know, I was talking about our natural laws and how we're bringing these into back into our governance. I'll say not bringing them in. It's nothing new. It's very, very old. That if we operate from this foundation, something like the Grand Rapids generating station could have never have been completed because it's such a violation of those natural laws. You know, they knew some of the effects, the physical effects I talked about, but I don't think there was very much understanding of the cultural and the spiritual impacts of that kind of development. And, you know, like the relationships that we had with our territory, a lot was severed. I mean, some of the territory was just lost. A lot of the territory, I think it's still the biggest flood in northern Manitoba. And it's a flood that doesn't recede. You know, the times that we're in right now, I think we need to really get back to some of those fundamentals and in order for our societies to not crumble. We're part of the you know, the Canadian context or whatever, you know, like we're still here, the original people. And I think the voice is getting stronger, and you know, that's why I'm happy to be here to kind of share some of what I've learned. And by no means am I consider myself an expert, but I know I have a unique perspective, being where I'm from, and that some people might appreciate that. And you know, when I know that, then I'm happy to share. And I you know, like I think there's a lot that we can contribute globally, and that we are already in the work that we're doing. Protecting our forests is, you know, protecting global climate, and understanding how we're doing that, and the foundation laws that we're coming from. We're, you know, we're open to sharing. Our people are very open, caring, sharing people, Even though we've been abused for so long, I think, you know, we're still here and we still have a lot of our strengths, and that Indigenous knowledge globally is going to be the key um, to ensuring that, you know, in our own self-interest, humankind can continue to live, that we can make a good life for our children, that our children have the basic necessities of life. They have food, they have water, you know, they are able to have a good life, you know, the math and that's what these natural laws produce. You follow them, you can have a good life, and we are supposed to be living on this planet. When we get lost in human ego and thinking that we can create laws that are going to be better than what those original instructions are, then, you know, we're running into trouble. I think it's an incredible time to be alive right now. It's scary, and it's also a huge opportunity that I see. Okay.
Yeah. That's great, Chief. Yeah, there's so many good points there. It was making me think of, I participated in a few webinars the last few months around Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter. And one of them was an international one. And one of the things the points I particularly made with my American friends was, it drives me crazy how the underlying smugness of so many Canadians. They think, oh, this must be an American thing. This isn't a Canadian thing. And it's that wake up that's required, because like you were saying, you know, Indigenous people are the ones who are bearing the consequences of the so-called development. And if you always compare yourself, if you look south of the border, oh, Canada is not as bad as the Americans are, you know, that's part of the problem. Recognizing it is the first step, that this is a fundamental part of Canadian history. Ryan McMahon, he's such a great comedian, makes a point about, you know, what's this about colonization? It's not about the past. We're being colonized every day. Every day, colonization happens. And the point you made about the hydro dams, you know, again, you'll get so many non-Indigenous people will think, oh, that's part of the past. Yeah, too bad we weren't as enlightened back then when they built the dam. We wouldn't do that now. Well, the fact is, like you were saying, Chief, it's affecting you, it's infringing your treaty every day. Every day. It's not just built and it disappears. It's going on every day. It happens every day. Someone turns on the tap. Every day someone turns on their lights. It's happening every day. And then the final point to make about that is that point about loss, right? Canadians love to think of themselves as upholding the rule of law, right? They love to think of themselves as, we have Section 35 in the Canadian Constitution. It is fantastic. We treat our Indigenous people better, right? But the fact is that when this type of environmental racism is allowed to happen, it undermines the entire promise of the Constitution. It undermines Section 35 of the Constitution, because the whole promise there is to ensure that Indigenous people as distinctive societies are perpetuated into the future. And how do you do it? You know, you do it through that connection to the land and the water. If Indigenous people don't have that day-to-day to teach the young people, this is who you are, it's built into the language itself. This is what you do. I think about it personally. I'm originally from Manitoba. We were displaced out of the Red River, ended up on the fringes of the Peguis Reserve with the rocks and the swamp up there trying to farm. And I remember when I was a kid, we would snare rabbits on this rock ridge not far from where we lived, and my older brothers taught me how to set a snare and catch the rabbits and go get them. I remember going back there recently. They built a road through there. They built a road through that rock ridge. Now there's a gravel quarry. There's no rabbits left around there. And on a smaller scale, it's the same kind of sense of loss. I'm thinking, where can I take my kids? I can't take my kids there where I used to go and show them how to set a snare. It's gone. All that stuff is gone. And I think that's one of the things that we all need to be really aware of. When you support, when you profit from the so-called development, you lose that. And you lose the promise of Section 35 of the Constitution.
Bruce and Chief Cook, thank you so much. And I've been scribbling notes furiously. I note that we have eight questions. So with your permission, Chief Cook, and I'm just going to tell Bruce McIvor that we're going to go to questions. But Chief Cook, is that okay with you if we move to questions now?
Sure.
Okay, and I think Heather Fast is going to share some of the questions with us.
Hello. I'm having trouble getting my video started. So just give me a sec, but that doesn't really matter at this point. We've had a number of questions that are interested in kind of the same thing, which would be hearing more from both of you about what the integration of Indigenous laws and our existing provincial and federal laws might look like. So any insight you might have, it seems a number of participants are very interested to hear about it.
And Bruce and Chief Cook, I'm not sure there's a particular order. Whoever wishes to go first, please lead on.
Why don't you go first, Chief, if you're fine with that?
Okay. The question is how Indigenous laws and Canadian laws can intersect. Is that right?
Correct.
Distracted by one of the questions I was reading. Sorry. I think I'll go back to our Indigenous Guardians program. So our Guardians are monitoring activity in our territory. They're collecting data on some key species that are important for our food security. And eventually, like, we're making plans to also develop monitoring plans for other species that are indicators for ecosystem health and that kind of thing. We're building our data set, that is understood by other governments, move towards an Indigenous protected area. So a number of years ago, Parks Canada was very active in pursuing a national park in our territory. They're still interested in having this region represented in the protected areas system. The provincial government is not there right now, so that's why they've had the door closed on them basically. But in our home, we're going about collecting information and preparing our governance systems so that we can protect our area through a new door that's been opened up in federal legislation, Indigenous protected areas, Indigenous protected and conserved areas. So there's examples of these being created in conjunction with Parks Canada and using, creating opening in legislation for Indigenous protected areas. So that's where we're moving, and I think that's a good example of how these two legal systems can work together, is just by creating the openings for Indigenous people to regain some of that control and being able to manage using our own Indigenous knowledge and legal systems.
Yeah, thanks, Chief. That's such a good point you make about creating that opening. I think that's some of the most important work that is being done and needs to be done all across the country. There's been a revitalization of an ongoing of Indigenous laws, finding those, how do you articulate them? How do you exercise them? That's fantastic work that Indigenous people are doing all across the country. Part of the problem now is that, how does the Canadian state recognize it? As you say, Chief, how do you create that opening? And this is where we're at, is there's revitalization happening, particular to different Indigenous peoples all the way across the country. But when you get up to respecting it, when you get up to recognizing it, when you get up to enforcing it, oops. And you'll see the courts now drawing back. I don't know how to do this, right? Or perhaps we can't. So a classic example that probably a lot of the people participating are aware of today is what's been going on with the CGL pipeline in northern BC. And the Unistoten, who have been in the news a lot the first part of this year, that's one of our clients. They've been trying to exercise their own Wet'suwet'en laws, but finding a way, a mechanism for that to be respected within the operation of Canadian law becomes a real challenge. I think one of the ways to deal with that is to get beyond this duty to consult talk. I get a lot of people are surprised when I say, if you're still talking duty to consult, you're back in the 20th century. Get into the 21st century here. We should not just be talking duty to consult. And I know this goes on so much still in Manitoba. I do a lot of work back there. We should be talking about exercising indigenous decision-making in parallel. Because the way the duty to consult works is that you're being consulted about a decision the provincial government is making. Indigenous people continue to be an input into that decision, instead of there being respect for Indigenous decision-making authority. And I think that's where we need to do, and governments can do that. We've got a file in Northern Ontario around the Ring of Fire, a so-called huge development. The provincial government there, a conservative government, has agreed to move towards not just duty to consult, but recognizing Indigenous decision-making authority, parallel to and equal to their own decision-making authority. That's the kind of work I think all provincial governments should be doing all across the country.
Yeah, that just reminded me of something I wanted to point out, is that when Parks Canada was originally ready to create a national park in conjunction with the province back in I think it was the early 2000s, the First Nation was not involved, and that's why it was put to a stop, because it was, two governments coming in, making all the rules. It's drawing the boundaries and having huge impact on our rights and our territory without any involvement, any meaningful consultation. And the First Nation put a stop to the process. And you know, after a cooling off period, we re-entered a discussion on where our common values might lie, and a commitment from the government that there would be no protected area created without the consent of the First Nation.
Thank you very much for those responses. I hope that should satisfy all the people that were asking those questions. I know we're coming close to the end of our time, and we've gotten many wonderful questions, so thank you to everyone. We're unfortunately not going to be able to get to all of them. But I think it would be great if both of you could tell us a little bit more, maybe give some advice to law students, new lawyers, people just generally in the community. How do we learn more about some of the fantastic things like your Indigenous Guardians program, Chief Cook, and also Bruce, where do we learn more and gain the tools to help create some of this change and help incorporate some of these Indigenous traditions and laws into Canadian law? So if you have any advice for students or people working in the community, I think it'd be really great to try and highlight some resources or places that they can go to learn more and start arming themselves to help create the change you two have talked so wonderfully about.
Bruce, you want to go first on this one?
Okay, sure. Okay, thanks, Chief. Well, part of the work my firm does, just because this is what I'm most familiar with, of course, is we're lawyers. We practice law across the country, but we put a lot of time and resources into public education. So that we really think to make a difference, you need to be part of that wider national conversation. So we do a lot of that, and some of you may be aware of it. You can go to our website, firstpeopleslaw.com. We've got a very active blog where we talk about a lot of these things. We've got a reading list for people by topic. How do you start to inform yourself about these things? We have a couple of free download publications. One of them's this one. It's just downloaded off our website. We've got one just on the web. So you can download for free. I think we've had the first one, something like 10,000 downloads. We've just begun a podcast. So if podcasting is your thing, there's that. There's a lot of great resources on our website. And we also have links to other great resources all across the country, because there's so much fantastic work that both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are doing. And to be part of that, I think personally, is some of the best work that any of us can be doing.
Yeah, I agree. I'm subscribed to the First People's Law newsletter as well. And I think anybody interested who starts searching out some of those resources, you'll find yourself, you can go down a lot of different paths in discovery. Yeah, and you know, like know the people from where you are, I think you know, I was gonna say, well, talk to people, but then I think about my own self and how busy I am. Like, I don't want everyone in Manitoba calling me. But you know, like there's a lot of resources out there, and we work with a lot of different organizations um, who provide help along the way, and they're open. There's lots out there to discover.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chief Cook and Bruce, and um, just uh, just on behalf of the participants in the website and behalf of the Public Interest Law Center, the Eco Center, and certainly our colleagues at the University of Winnipeg and Robson Hall, we're very grateful for your time. And just a couple sentences that just stuck in my mind, Chief Cook, your message about the disadvantage that has been manufactured, just such a powerful a message to us. And the message from both of you about creating an opening as we seek to renew our relationship with natural laws and with First Nation laws is so profound. So I do want to thank you, and obviously, again, the Manitoba Law Foundation for making this event possible, our colleagues at the University of Winnipeg and at Robson Hall, and certainly the Eco Center, the Eco Network, excuse me, Glenn, you're going to be mad at me, the Manitoba Eco Network and the Public Interest Law Center. We do have a couple of, this is the first of 6 webinars, and I just want to let you know the next 2 that are coming up. In October, we'll be talking about accessing legislative change, making a difference with legislators and with government. And we have some fantastic speakers both at from the federal and provincial level. And in November, we're going to get a bit more litigious, and we're going to ask our class actions the way to go. And our speakers in that presentation, one is a young individual from Quebec and is one of the people leading the class action relating to climate change, and also from the University of Windsor Class Action Law Clinic. So we're very excited. We're so honored for the speakers we've had today. And if you can stay tuned for just the next couple of minutes, you'll see the promotional videos for our event in October in terms of accessing legislative change. Again, we just want to thank the many people who've joined the webinar and stayed on the webinar, and for the great questions. And some of those questions, obviously, as a team, we'll be reading and reflecting on as well. So with that, I'd like to again thank Chief Cook and Dr. McIvor and for taking their time. And we'll move now to the promotional videos. I'll also note that there's an exit survey at the end.
Well, for 2 years, I was legislative assistant to a member of parliament who was also the chair of the Standing Committee on the Environment and Sustainable Development in the House. And that gave me a really great viewpoint for watching how legislation makes its way through the Parliament of Canada. First of all, it's recognizing that the legislative process is part of a much bigger set of institutions and processes. One is that legislation is really, for better or for worse, a subset of the policy-making process. And policy, despite what we might sometimes think, comes first. And there's a whole machinery, both inside and outside government, that is involved in making that. And so my task is often to try and figure out how all of those processes and institutions work.
So it may not be as straightforward as an outside observer might at first think it would be.
I think like a lot of things, like how our car engine works, to take a purely literally mechanical example, there's a lot more to it. We can get in and drive, and we may assume, and quite gladly for most of us, that it just works. But how is what interests me. And I hope that ultimately helps my clients when I delve deeper.
Okay, thank you for these preliminary insights. We have one last question before I let you go on a different topic. Could you tell us about a favorite local beverage maker of yours?
I'm glad you asked that question, and I'll tell you why. Is that I like, ideally, to travel all over Canada. And so I like to have the most local, juicy, hoppy, and hazy beer that I can find that's been made close to where I happen to be. I'm particularly pleased to find that Trailway Brewing in Fredericton, New Brunswick has a beer that looks like it might be named after me because it's called Hugh John Hops. And I just found it here in Montreal a few days ago to my surprise, and I'm going to crack it open tonight and give it a try. I'll let you know my report.
I've been working in the environmental nonprofit sector for over 30 years now. And in Manitoba, we started a new piece of legislation called the Waste Reduction and Prevention Act. And it was like a clean slate, and all the stakeholders were invited to participate in developing that piece of legislation. So back then, I learned what legislation is and how important it is in sort of directing society and doing good things to protect the environment. I've been with other organizations since. I've been a community organizer with the Beyond Factory Farming Coalition, and also I was a co-founder of Hogwatch Manitoba. And both those organizations were heavily engaged in the legislative process in trying to make better regulations and laws to protect the environment. What I've done in the past is use the legislation there to become more involved. So, that's writing complaints to the provincial ombudsman. It's using FIPA, Freedom of Information legislation to get information to help your cause. And then, of course, one could make presentations to the Manitoba legislature when bills are presented for second reading. So numerous groups, do that sort of work to try to make a piece of law, a better piece of law.
Thank you very much for these insights. Just to cap off with something a little different, could you tell us about favorite local beverage maker of yours?
Well, actually, my good friend Phil, he grows his own hops and he makes his own beer, and he's got a batch that he's recently made that, makes me want to come back to his place and have a beer quite often. So my friend Phil's beer is the top beverage for me right now.
All right, shout out to Phil. Thank you very much, Glenn. I'm looking forward to the webinar.
Okay, great, thanks.
I've been with the Mining Association Canada for 29 years, almost 3 decades. In the same job, although the job has evolved over time. Some of the things, the main things I've been working on is the various iteration of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, which is now the Impact Assessment Act. I've worked on the Canadian Environmental Protection Act through its reviews, Fisheries Act, and the many lives of the Navigable Waters Act. And so looking back, I want to share, okay, how would I have done it better? It is an interesting process, but it's just one little piece of the overall process of achieving some kind of progress on towards the goal, whatever goal you have in mind.
Thank you very much for all of those insights. We do have one quick last question that's completely separate from all of these more serious topics. And we're just hoping to get an insight into a favorite beverage maker of yours, maybe one that's local to you.
Bose Lug Tread all the way.
Okay.
Love Bose, and if I could also add, I actually had a Jets jersey all prepared for this promo recording, and I was so disappointed that they're out of the playoffs maybe next year.